A racist woman storms Big Shaq's lakeside cabin, trying to kick him off his own land. But she has no idea what legacy she's challenging. What follows isn't just a clash, it's a reckoning. When buried deeds, old money and dark secrets surface, Big Shaq doesn't just stand his ground, he ignites a war that exposes everything. What happens next will leave you stunned. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Big Shaq's SUV glided along the winding gravel road, the afternoon sun painting long shadows across the towering Alabama pines. It had been years since he'd taken this road. Years since he'd driven out past the main highway, past the clusters of worn-down diners and old gas stations, past the old signs proclaiming Lake Bellemere. But now, as the shimmering blue of the lake peeked through the trees, Shaq felt a deep ache of nostalgia twisting in his chest. This wasn't just a cabin, it was a lifeline. It was the place where he and his mother, Lucille, had found peace when the world beyond the trees got too loud, too cruel. The wheels crunched over the familiar path, pulling up to the old wooden cabin, nestled between two ancient oaks. Its paint was faded now, weathered by years of wind and rain, but the place still stood solid, rooted like a monument to his mother's resilience. He stepped out of the vehicle, inhaling the crisp lake air. The gentle lapping of water against the shore was a melody of memories. Summer afternoons, fishing off the dock, evenings watching fireflies dance in the dark. His throat tightened, but he didn't let the emotion show. As he walked up the steps to the cabin porch, the wood creaked beneath his weight, a sound both familiar and slightly unsettling. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, pausing to take in the scent of aged wood, of dust and pine, of a past too precious to forget. On the mantel above the cold fireplace sat an old photograph of Lucille, her smile radiating strength. She had loved this place fiercely, despite the whispers from neighbors who always acted as if this land didn't quite belong to them. He'd heard those whispers growing up, the hushed comments at the gas station, the stares from men who thought their lineage gave them more right to the land than his family's blood and sweat. But Lucille never let it bother her. "This land is ours, Shaquille," she used to say, "and don't you let anyone tell you otherwise." But now, standing alone in the cabin's dim light, Shaq felt an unease he couldn't shake. He walked to the window and peered out over the lake. The sun glinted off the water, but a figure stood at the edge of the trees, half hidden in shadow. It was distant, almost indistinguishable, but he felt eyes on him. The figure didn't move, just lingered like a silent accusation. When Shaq turned back to check the window again, the figure was gone. He shook his head, dismissing it as a trick of the light, the mind playing games with memory and grief. Yet, as he moved through the cabin, dusting off old tables and checking the cupboards, he couldn't silence the feeling that he wasn't quite alone. There were small signs, a slight shift of the curtain he hadn't touched, footprints faintly etched in the soft dirt just outside the back door. He told himself not to be paranoid. After all, this was his family's land. He had every right to be here. But that didn't stop the subtle tension from coiling in his gut. As he stood at the back window, looking out over the lake, he saw movement again, this time closer. A rustle of leaves, a shadow flitting through the trees. He narrowed his eyes, trying to focus, but whoever or whatever it was had vanished by the time he reached the door. With a deep breath, he turned away, determined to reclaim the serenity this place had always offered. He lit a fire in the stone hearth, the crackling of flames pushing back the encroaching chill of doubt. The warmth filled the room, chasing away the dark corners and filling the space with light. He found himself relaxing, sinking into the old leather chair by the fire, letting the rhythmic sounds of the lake and the popping fire lull him into a sense of peace. Yet, the tranquility was fragile. Every small noise, a branch brushing against the window, the distant call of a loon across the water, sent his mind spinning into cautious alertness. This wasn't just nostalgia playing tricks. Something was off. He remembered stories Lucille used to tell him about old land disputes, about neighbors who'd quietly pressured black families out of their rightful homes. She had always laughed them off, but now sitting here alone, Shaq wondered if there had been more truth to those warnings than he'd ever imagined. He rose and went to the old wooden chest near the hearth, the one where Lucille kept her letters and mementos. As he opened it, the familiar scent of lavender drifted up, a small comfort. He sifted through the papers, searching for something he couldn't quite name, a reassurance perhaps, that this place was still his. Still safe. He found the deed tucked between yellowed pages of an old journal. It was worn, the ink faded, but the message was clear. This land belonged to Lucille, and by extension to him. Still, the unease lingered. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees. Shaq stepped outside, locking the door behind him, and stood on the porch scanning the horizon. The lake shimmered gold under the last light of day, but the trees beyond seemed darker than they should, as if holding their breath. A rustle behind him made him turn. But there was nothing there, only the wind sighing through the pines. He stayed there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around him, forcing his muscles to unclench. This was his land. This was his home. Whatever whispers of the past still haunted these woods, he wouldn't be driven away. But as he turned to go back inside, he saw it again, a figure clearer this time, standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. And Shaq knew, deep down, that the return to serenity was going to be anything but simple. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the golden light filtering through the pines and spilling across the lake like melted honey. Shaq stood on the porch of his family's cabin, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand, trying to shake the disquiet that had settled over him the night before. The warmth of the sun couldn't quite chase away the lingering sense of being watched. The stillness of the air seemed almost expectant, as though it was waiting for something to happen. And something did. The sound of gravel crunching under tires broke the fragile quiet. Shaq turned sharply, his broad frame tense, as a pearl-white Cadillac crawled up the path, its polished surface gleaming like a threat. The car came to a stop a few yards from the porch, and a tall, lean woman stepped out. Her tailored beige slacks and crisp white blouse spoke of wealth and control, but it was her expression, a cold, practiced smile with lips too tight, that sent a ripple of unease through Shaq's gut. She carried herself with a deliberate air of ownership, as though the very ground beneath her heels was hers by right. She strode up the porch steps, without invitation. "Good morning," she said, her voice sweet as honey, but edged with a note that cut. "You must be Mr. O'Neill." Her eyes flicked over him, cool and assessing, lingering just a second too long on his skin. "I'm Elaine Masters. I'm with the Lake Bellemere Homeowners Association." She extended her hand, her nails manicured to a gleaming, aggressive red. Shaq set his coffee down slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't take her hand. "I know who you are," he said, his voice deep and steady. "And you know this cabin's been in my family for years." Elaine's smile tightened. "Ah, well, there's been some confusion, you see. I've had a few complaints from the neighbors. They weren't expecting visitors." Her voice dripped with false concern, the way a snake might coil gently around its prey. "And with the recent changes in ownership of some properties around here, we thought we'd clarify who has rights to this land." Shaq felt his jaw tense, but he didn't let it show. "There's no confusion," he said quietly. "This is my family's property. The deed's in my name." Elaine's brows arched delicately. "Well, it's just that some of us were under the impression that this parcel might have shifted ownership during the last settlement. There were some irregularities, some missing paperwork. I'm sure you understand. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." Her voice held the syrupy tone of someone pretending to care while delivering a veiled threat. She glanced past him into the cabin, her eyes narrowing slightly as though assessing what was worth taking. Shaq crossed his arms over his chest, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. His presence was commanding, without being aggressive, his calm like a wall she couldn't push through. "I understand perfectly," he said, his tone cool. "This land's not going anywhere. Not without a fight." Elaine's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Now let's not be dramatic, Mr. O'Neill. No one wants a fight. We just want to ensure everyone's on the same page. It would be unfortunate if there were any legal complications." She let the words hang in the air like smoke, watching for any sign of weakness. Shaq didn't flinch. He stepped forward, forcing her to take an instinctive step back. "You're welcome to check the records. The deed's clear. The papers are in order. I have nothing to hide." His voice resonated with quiet authority, a subtle reminder that he wasn't just some city man playing house in the woods. He was Shaquille O'Neal, a man who had built himself from the ground up, who had faced down worse than a woman with a sharp tongue and a crooked smile. Elaine's eyes flickered with something, frustration perhaps, or calculation. She wasn't used to being challenged, not here in Lake Bellemere, where her word was law and her money moved silent hands. But she recovered quickly, smoothing a stray hair back into place. Of course," she said lightly, though her tone was now tinged with frost. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. I'll have my attorney reach out to you. Perhaps we can resolve this amicably." Shaq inclined his head slightly. You do that, he said, his voice a low rumble of finality. Elaine's smile faltered, just for a moment, before she turned on her heel and descended the steps. Enjoy your stay, she called over her shoulder, her voice sugar-coated with false sweetness. For however long it lasts. Shaq watched her drive away, the Cadillac's tires kicking up a thin cloud of dust that hung in the air long after she'd gone. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with a tension that hadn't been there before. He stood there for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, not out of fear but out of a growing realization that this was more than just a neighborly dispute. Elaine hadn't come to clarify ownership. She had come to intimidate, to lay the groundwork for something deeper, something uglier. As the dust settled, Shaq turned back into the cabin, his mind already racing through the possibilities. There were no legal complications, not unless someone created them. And someone, it seemed, intended to do just that. He glanced at the photograph of his mother on the mantel, her gaze steady and unwavering. Lucille had known how to stand her ground, how to fight back without raising her voice. He would do the same. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully, but the uneasy feeling lingered like a shadow. Shaq checked the perimeter of the cabin, noting the slight disturbances, the faint tracks near the edge of the woods, the subtle signs of someone watching from a distance. Elaine's visit wasn't a one-off. It was a warning, a probing test to see how far she could push. He knew this game. He'd seen it before in boardrooms, in back rooms, where deals were made with handshakes and threats. As the sun arced higher, casting sharp light over the lake, Shaq sat on the porch, his mind replaying Elaine's words, her tone, the hidden meaning behind every polite phrase. She was testing boundaries, not just legal ones, but personal, probing for weakness. But she hadn't counted on his quiet strength, on his refusal to be cowed by veiled threats and false civility. The lake shimmered in the distance, serene and beautiful, but Shaq knew the stillness was deceptive. Beneath the surface, currents swirled, pulling at the foundations of his peace, and he wasn't about to let them drag him under. That afternoon the cabin felt too quiet, the air thick with the residue of Elaine's intrusion. Shaq moved through the rooms with measured steps, the weight of her words settling heavier than he cared to admit. His mother's voice echoed faintly in his mind, a constant reminder that this land was more than just dirt and timber. It was her legacy. It was family. He crossed the creaking floorboards to the old desk tucked away in the corner of the living room, a sturdy thing his mother had used to pay bills and write letters. The drawers were stiff from years of disuse, the metal handles cool beneath his fingers as he tugged one open. Inside there was nothing but a scattering of pens and an old checkbook. Shaq frowned, his mind sharpening. He opened the next drawer, finding a jumble of receipts, papers yellowed with age, and a few family photographs of Lucille smiling by the lake. His heart squeezed, but he pressed on. The bottom drawer stuck, as though resisting, but he pulled harder and it slid open with a groan of protest. There, tucked neatly beneath a stack of old tax forms, was a thick envelope marked with Lucille's careful handwriting, property deed, Lake Bellemere. Shaq drew the envelope out with deliberate care, his pulse quickening. He slipped the papers free and unfolded them, scanning the familiar signatures, the crisp official seals. The deed was authentic, his mother's name, then his own, marking the transfer of ownership. Every detail was in order, every legal requirement met. This land was his, beyond dispute. Yet Elaine's casual certainty, her venom-laced suggestion of irregularities, gnawed at him. Why would she insist there was a question over something so clear? He set the papers on the desk and stared at them, his mind running through the possibilities. Maybe it was just arrogance, the assumption that a black man like him couldn't possibly hold rightful claim to prime lakeside property. Maybe it was the old undercurrent of prejudice that ran through Lake Bellemere, like a hidden current beneath the still water. But Shaq had faced that kind of prejudice before, and this felt different. It wasn't just her disdain, it was her confidence, the way she'd mentioned missing paperwork as if she already knew something he didn't. Determined to understand, he rifled through the rest of the drawer, looking for anything else his mother might have left behind. There were letters from old friends, an envelope of photographs, and a small battered notebook. He flipped through the pages, Lucille's looping handwriting chronicling years of cabin maintenance, notes about weatherproofing, and reminders to renew the property taxes. Near the back, a few pages were dog-eared, and there he found an entry dated nearly 20 years ago. Spoke with county clerk today, says there's a discrepancy in Redmond's old maps. Told me not to worry, but something feels off. Must keep an eye out. Trust no one. Shaq's pulse spiked. Redmond. That name itched at the back of his mind like a splinter. Thomas Redmond had been one of the wealthiest men in the area. A developer with a reputation for getting what he wanted, even if it meant bending the law. His family still held sway in town, though Redmond himself had passed years ago. Elaine's smug confidence suddenly made more sense. If Redmond's name was connected to the land, if there had been an old scheme to claim properties illegally, it could explain why Elaine was so insistent. She wasn't just pushing back against Shaq's presence. She was continuing something bigger, older. He sat back in the chair, his thoughts racing. His mother had clearly known there was something shady with Redmond's dealings, but she dismissed it, trusted that her deed was strong enough to stand against any challenge. And it should have been. But if Elaine and her allies were digging into old maps and long-forgotten documents, they might be trying to resurrect claims that had no real basis, using intimidation and manipulation to force Shaq off his own land. The sound of tires crunching faintly on the gravel outside pulled Shaq out of his thoughts. He rose swiftly, crossing to the window, heart thudding. A dark-colored sedan idled just beyond the trees, a figure barely visible behind the wheel. It didn't approach the cabin, didn't make any move, just sat there as if waiting, watching. After a long moment, the car turned slowly and slipped back down the road. Suspense clawed at Shaq's nerves. This wasn't paranoia. Someone was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He glanced at the deed again, his fingers brushing the embossed seal. It was his, but he could almost hear Elaine's voice echoing, dripping with false concern. Wouldn't want any legal complications. The threat hadn't been overt, but it was there, thick with unspoken promises. She wasn't planning to fight him in the open. She was laying traps waiting for him to stumble. Shaq folded the deed and tucked it back into the envelope, slipping it into the inner pocket of his jacket. He wasn't about to leave it sitting in a drawer where anyone could get to it. He glanced around the cabin, the walls closing in a little tighter now. Every creak of the wood, every shadow stretching across the floorboards felt charged with hidden danger. He knew he couldn't just sit here and wait. He needed to find out exactly what Elaine was up to, and more importantly why she wanted this land so badly. The late afternoon light slanted through the windows, long and golden, but Shaq felt no comfort in its glow. He made his way outside, scanning the tree line, every instinct on high alert. Whoever was behind this, they were organized, confident, and they weren't counting on him fighting back. They didn't know that he wasn't just a man with a cabin, he was a man with a legacy to defend. As he stood on the porch, the lake rippling calmly behind him, Shaq realized that this wasn't about prejudice alone. It was about power, greed, and a past that someone was desperate to rewrite at his expense. He straightened his shoulders, determination hardening in his chest. If they thought they could push him off this land with veiled threats and crooked schemes, they had no idea who they were dealing with. By the next day, the air around Lake Bellemere seemed to hum with an undercurrent of tension, as if the very trees were whispering secrets carried on the breeze. Shaq felt it the moment he stepped outside, the unease crawling along his spine. The sunlight was bright and sharp, yet it failed to cut through the gathering shadows of suspicion. The lake, once a place of calm and reflection, now mirrored the rising discomfort in his gut. Word had spread faster than wildfire. In town, whispers turned into sideways glances, polite nods into thinly veiled disdain. Elaine's influence, it seemed, stretched further than the porch of her prime lakeside home. She had wasted no time in painting Shaq as an interloper, someone who didn't belong. It wasn't enough that his name was on the deed, that his family had owned the land for decades. In her hands, the truth twisted, becoming something to mold and weaponize. The rumors rippled through the community like a stone tossed into still water. At the local general store, he felt it first. The tight smiles, the clipped answers, the sudden shift in conversation. As he entered, he wasn't new to prejudice, but there was a sharpness here, a practiced edge honed by whispers and quiet phone calls behind closed doors. It wasn't the blatant, in-your-face hostility he'd seen elsewhere. It was colder, more insidious, a calculated exclusion. When he stepped to the counter to pay for supplies, the cashier's hands trembled slightly, her voice a touch too loud and polite. Back at the cabin, Shaq's thoughts churned. Elaine wasn't acting alone. The subtle pressure, the whispered suggestions, the concern of the neighbors, it was a pattern. And the man at the center of the pattern was Clifford Boone. Clifford was a name Shaq remembered from his childhood visits to the lake, though they'd never crossed paths. A self-styled land baron with a network of silent backers, Clifford had a reputation for pushing people out, buying them off, or simply making life so uncomfortable that they left. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Shaq stood by the water's edge, the cool breeze lifting the scent of pine and damp earth. A low murmur of voices drifted across the lake from a nearby dock. He turned and saw them, Clifford Boone, and a small group of men lounging near a sleek motorboat, their postures casual but their eyes sharp with intent. Clifford was tall and wiry, his silver hair slicked back, his smile a practiced blend of charm and condescension. They didn't call out, but the message was clear in the way they watched him, in the deliberate laughter that floated across the water, in the way one man pointed subtly toward the cabin. Shaq stood his ground, offering nothing in return but a steady gaze. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of reacting. But inside, his frustration simmered. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to intimidate. That evening, as the sky bruised purple and gold, Shaq heard the sound of a truck engine idling near the cabin. He stepped outside, his silhouette framed against the light spilling from the doorway. Clifford himself leaned against the truck's door, arms crossed, his expression almost amused. "Even, Shaquille," he drawled, his tone dripping with false friendliness. "Didn't expect to see you sticking around. Folks round here don't take kindly to outsiders stirring things up." Shaq kept his voice low, measured. "I'm not stirring anything. Just living in my family's cabin, like I always have a right to." Clifford's smile tightened, and he stepped closer, his shadow stretching long in the dimming light. "Funny thing though, word is, there's some question about the deed. Rumor has it, some papers might be missing. Lot of folks think it'd be best if you moved along before it gets messy." His tone was casual, but the weight behind the words was unmistakable. Shaq's jaw clenched, but he refused to be drawn into a shouting match. "I've got the papers. Everything's in order. You know it, and I know it. You think you can intimidate me with rumors and whispers, but it won't work." Clifford's chuckle was low and dark. "Ain't about intimidation, son. It's about keeping things smooth and quiet. You don't want the whole town against you, do you? You're a smart man, Shaquille. You know how these things work." Shaq held his ground, his voice steady as a rock. "I know exactly how they work, but I'm not going anywhere. You'll have to do better than whispers and empty threats." Clifford's eyes flashed, and for a moment, the mask slipped, revealing a flicker of frustration beneath the polished surface. But just as quickly he composed himself, tipping his head in mock respect. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you. You got a nice place here. Be a shame if something happened to it." Shaq didn't respond, didn't move, just watched as Clifford climbed back into the truck, the engine rumbling to life. The truck rolled away slowly, disappearing into the gathering dusk, leaving a trail of dust curling behind it. Inside the cabin, the quiet returned, but it was a brittle quiet, filled with unspoken threats and the weight of impending confrontation. Shaq paced the floor, his mind racing through options, strategies. He knew they were closing in, not with violence but with words, with rumors, with carefully orchestrated pressure designed to push him to the edge. They were trying to drown him in suspicion and isolation, turning the community against him one whisper at a time. But they didn't count on his resolve. They didn't count on the fact that this was more than a fight for a piece of land. It was a fight for dignity, for legacy, for the quiet strength his mother had instilled in him. The whispers over the water might have been loud in town, but here in the cabin built with love and sacrifice, Shaq's voice would be louder. As night settled over Lake Bellemere, the reflection of moonlight on the water's surface was broken by the ripple of a breeze. Shaq stood at the window, watching the lake, his thoughts sharp, his resolve unshaken. Whatever whispers Elaine and Clifford were spreading, whatever rumors they seeded among the townsfolk, he would face them, not with fists or fury, but with the quiet, immovable certainty that he belonged. He would not be driven out, not by words, not by fear, not by that. The silence of night wrapped around the cabin like a thick shroud, punctuated only by the rhythmic chirp of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl from the trees. Shaq sat in the worn leather chair by the fireplace, the glow from the dying embers casting flickering shadows across the walls. Sleep wouldn't come. The weight of Elaine's insinuations and Clifford's barely veiled threats lingered in his mind, refusing to be shaken off like dust. His eyes, heavy with fatigue, were just beginning to close when the phone on the kitchen wall rang. The sudden shrill cut through the stillness, making him jolt upright. He crossed the room in a few swift strides, lifting the receiver to his ear. "Hello?" His voice was rough, but steady. For a moment, there was only silence on the line, a static hush that crackled softly like distant rain. Then a woman's voice whispered, low and urgent, "You're not safe. They've done this before." The words were hushed but clear, tinged with a fear that sent a chill down his spine. "Who is this?" Shaq's voice was firm, but there was a tension in his chest, a pulse of unease that quickened with each passing second. But the caller had already hung up, the line going dead with a hollow click that left the cabin feeling darker, more isolated than before. Shaq stood there staring at the phone, the weight of the message sinking in. This wasn't just idle gossip or small-town prejudice. Someone was watching, waiting, orchestrating a plan that had been set into motion long before he arrived. He sat back down, the urgency of the call tightening his thoughts into sharp focus. Who was the woman? Why the warning? And most importantly, what did she mean by "they've done this before"? He rose again, his body thrumming with adrenaline, and paced the room. His mother's old papers were still spread out across the desk where he'd left them. The deed was safe, but that alone wouldn't protect him from whatever scheme was unfolding around him. Determined to find answers, Shaq grabbed his keys and drove into town, his headlights cutting through the darkness as he made his way to the county records office. The building was dark, but he knew the back entrance would be unlocked. It wasn't breaking in. He had every right to check the records, especially now. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and old paper. He flipped through the files, scanning for any mention of Redmond, of land disputes, of claims and counterclaims that might explain Elaine and Clifford's sudden interest in his family's property. He found a set of records from decades ago, detailing how Redmond's development company had expanded aggressively, snapping up land from small property owners under questionable circumstances. There were hints of legal challenges, but nothing overt, just quiet settlements, quiet departures, and stories that faded into silence. His pulse quickened as he read a note in one file. Land acquisitions, near Lake Bellemere, finalized. Remaining holdouts expected to comply. The phrasing was cold, impersonal, like pieces on a chessboard. His mother's cabin must have been one of the few properties they hadn't managed to claim. But why? The pattern was clear. Systematic pressure, threats, rumors, and eventually forced sales. Now with Redmond gone, it seemed Elaine and Clifford were intent on finishing what he'd started. Shaq's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about him. It was about the legacy his mother had fought to preserve, about a quiet battle that had been raging beneath the surface of this seemingly serene town for years. The realization burned through his frustration, stoking a deeper resolve. He wasn't just defending his right to a piece of land. He was standing against a system designed to erase people like him from places like this. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, Shaq returned to the cabin. The whispers in the night, the shadowed figures at the edge of the woods, the sudden surge of rumors. It all pointed to a carefully laid plan. The warning from the midnight caller wasn't just a fluke. It was a sign that someone, perhaps from within their circle, was trying to give him a chance, a lifeline in a town that had long since decided who belonged and who didn't. Inside the cabin, he spread the records out on the table, piecing together the timeline, connecting names and properties with the thin threads of corruption and control that had shaped Lake Bellemere for decades. Each connection made the picture clearer, and the stakes higher. They'd done it before, driven out landowners with pressure and deceit, and now they were coming for him. But Shaq wasn't going to be another quiet footnote in their history. He stood at the window, the first light of day spilling across the lake, his reflection sharp against the glass. The night had left him weary, but his determination had crystallized into something unshakable. He thought of Lucille, her quiet strength, her refusal to bow to pressure. He thought of the woman's whispered warning, her fear and urgency. This fight wasn't just his. It was a continuation of a struggle that stretched back through generations. Shaq knew now that Elaine and Clifford weren't working alone. Their power came from old alliances, from networks of influence that reached deep into the town's history. But they hadn't counted on his resilience, on his refusal to be intimidated by shadows and threats. They'd underestimated him because of who he was, because of the quiet way he carried himself. That was their mistake. He turned away from the window, ready to face whatever came next. The whispers over the water were louder now, the shadows more insistent, but Shaq's resolve was solid. The fight for his family's legacy wasn't just a battle over land. It was a stand against the quiet erasure of dignity and belonging. Whatever lay ahead, he would meet it head-on, not with fists or fury, but with unwavering strength and a determination to outlast them all. The cabin's walls seemed to whisper with secrets, long buried beneath layers of pine and plaster. But it was the unease gnawing at Shaq's gut that finally made him act. The midnight call, the old records from the county office, the weight of his mother's quiet warnings. They weren't coincidences. There was something here, something waiting to be uncovered, and he wouldn't ignore it any longer. The morning light slanted across the worn floorboards as Shaq moved through the cabin with a purpose, his heavy footsteps echoing in the stillness. He started in the living room, pressing along the seams of the paneling, tapping gently with his knuckles, listening for the telltale shift in tone. The cabin had always felt solid, but he'd grown up with Lucille's quiet caution, her watchful eye that caught things others missed. He trusted her instincts more than his own. As he ran his hand along the edge of the stone fireplace, his fingers brushed against a faint ridge, a seam nearly invisible beneath the grain of the wood. His heart kicked up a notch. He pressed, and with a soft groan, the panel gave way, revealing a narrow compartment behind it. Inside were a bundle of old letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, and a small leather-bound ledger, worn but meticulously kept. Shaq drew them out carefully, the scent of old paper and lavender filling the air, a faint echo of his mother's presence. He sat at the kitchen table, untying the ribbon with hands that trembled just slightly, and began to read. The letters were addressed to his mother, signed by names he didn't recognize. People who spoke in guarded terms about land deals, shady promises, and the shadow of a man named Thomas Redmond. One letter in particular caught his eye. It was dated nearly 30 years ago, and written in a hurried, slanted script. Lucille, you were right to be cautious. Redmond's not just buying land, he's controlling it. He's using dummy companies to hide his involvement, pushing families off their properties. They're rewriting records, losing deeds. Don't trust the county office. Protect your land. I'm afraid for what might happen if you don't. Shaq felt his stomach twist as he read the lines again, the weight of them settling heavily on his shoulders. His mother had known. She'd suspected Redmond's schemes, and had taken steps to protect her property. But how deep did it go? He opened the ledger, flipping through pages filled with dates, names, and coded notations. It was Lucille's handwriting, neat and precise, chronicling every payment made, every correspondence, every quiet resistance to Redmond's encroachment. One entry stood out. July 1995. Found evidence of Redmond's false title claims. Kept copies in safe compartment. Confided only in trusted friend. Will not let them erase us. Shaq's pulse raced. The evidence, proof of Redmond's fraudulent dealings, had been hidden away in this cabin for decades, quietly waiting for the day when someone would need it. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just about Elaine's veiled threats, or Clifford's smug intimidation. They were continuing a plan set in motion years ago, a scheme to control the lake and its surrounding lands by any means necessary. He pieced together the timeline in his mind. Redmond's land acquisitions weren't simply business. They were calculated power plays, backed by influence and money, designed to erase certain families from Lake Bellemere. His mother had resisted quietly, keeping meticulous records and safeguarding the truth. But with Redmond gone, his allies were moving to finish the job. Elaine's sudden interest, Clifford's casual threats, the midnight call, they were all threads of the same tangled web. Shaq felt the air in the cabin tighten around him, as if the walls themselves were closing in with the weight of the truth. He rose, pacing the floor, his mind racing through the implications. The letters in the ledger were a map to understanding the depth of the conspiracy, but they were also dangerous. If Elaine or Clifford suspected he had them, they'd stop at nothing to silence him. Not through violence, perhaps, but through legal manipulation, through isolating him further, through slowly squeezing him out until he had no choice but to leave. The sun shifted higher, casting slivers of light through the windows. But Shaq felt no comfort in the warmth. He knew now that the struggle wasn't just about prejudice or personal vendettas. It was about erasure, about power wielded quietly and effectively against those who dared to resist. His mother's voice echoed softly in his memory, her steady assurance that truth mattered, that standing your ground wasn't just stubbornness, it was survival. A faint sound outside the window made him turn sharply. A truck idled near the edge of the property, its engine low and steady. Shaq stepped back into the shadows, watching as the vehicle lingered. He couldn't see who was inside, but the message was clear. They were watching, waiting for him to slip up, to make a move they could use against him. The pressure was rising, the walls closing in. Yet, in the face of that quiet menace, Shaq felt a deep resolve settle in his bones. He gathered the letters and ledger, tucking them into a satchel. He wouldn't hide them here, not anymore. If they were willing to rewrite history, he'd make sure the truth was louder than their lies. He thought about who he could trust, who might still have the courage to stand with him against the silent tide of erasure. As he stood at the cabin door, the weight of the satchel against his side, the wind stirred the trees, whispering secrets only the land could hear. This wasn't just about holding onto a piece of property. It was about claiming a place in a history others wanted to erase. The secret in the walls wasn't just a record of corruption. It was a testament to resilience, a quiet rebellion that he now carried forward. Shaq knew the days ahead would be filled with tension and careful maneuvering. The whispers had grown into a murmur that spread across the lake, carried on the breeze. But he wouldn't be silenced. He wouldn't let them rewrite the past or dictate his future. As he locked the cabin door behind him and stepped into the sunlight, the weight of his mother's legacy in his hands, he felt a quiet determination settle in his chest. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The morning broke over Lake Bellemere. With a deceptive calm, Shaq awoke to the distant echo of tires crunching over gravel, a low murmur rising beneath the hum of birdsong. His pulse quickened, the unease from the previous days threading its way through his thoughts like barbed wire. He knew it wasn't just another visit. This was the move they'd been orchestrating behind closed doors, the culmination of whispered threats and quiet pressures. He dressed quickly, slipping the ledger and letters into his satchel, securing them close. When he stepped onto the porch, the sight waiting for him tightened his jaw. 2 county sheriff vehicles idled at the edge of his property, their lights off but their presence loud. Clifford Boone stood with arms crossed near the trucks, his expression smug, a thick folder tucked under one arm. Elaine Masters hovered nearby, her posture stiff, her smile thin as ice. The sheriff, a man Shaq recognized as Deputy Marshal Paul Winslow, leaned against the door of his cruiser, his face unreadable beneath mirrored sunglasses. "Morning, Mr. O'Neill," Clifford called, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "We're here to sort out a little misunderstanding. Seems there's been some dispute over the ownership of this land." Shaq's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice calm. "There's no misunderstanding. This is my family's property, and I have the documents to prove it." Elaine's voice cut in, syrupy sweet, but tinged with steel. "Unfortunately, Mr. O'Neill, it appears there's some missing paperwork. County records show gaps in the deed transfer. Our attorneys have confirmed. The sheriff's just here to make sure things stay civil while we handle the transition." Shaq's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew this wasn't about legality. It was about intimidation, about leveraging a system that had never truly protected families like his. He met Paul Winslow's gaze squarely. "And you're just here to watch them steal what's mine?" Winslow shifted, discomfort flickering across his face. "I'm just here to keep the peace, Mr. O'Neill. Best to let the lawyers sort this out." His tone was neutral, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. Shaq felt the walls closing in, the familiar grip of power tightening around him. But he wasn't alone, not completely. Over the past few days, quiet gestures of support had surfaced from unexpected corners of the community. There was Grace Holloway, the elderly widow from town who'd whispered her doubts about Clifford's dealings. There was Henry Crawford, a local fisherman who'd muttered about old maps and crooked papers. Shaq had listened, nodded, let them know he heard their concern. Now, as the sheriff prepared to supervise the removal of a man from his own property, it was time to draw on that silent network. Shaq raised his voice, steady and clear. "I'd like a moment to speak with my neighbors before you do anything drastic." Clifford's lips thinned. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Shaquille." Ignoring him, Shaq turned toward the edge of his property, where a handful of cars and trucks had begun to gather, their drivers standing in quiet clusters. Word had spread, as it always did in small towns. He recognized faces from the general store, from church, from those who'd known his mother. He stepped forward, his voice carrying across the open space. "Folks, I know what you've been hearing. But you know me. You knew my mother. This cabin has been ours for generations, and it's ours now. They're trying to push me out with lies and threats, but I've got proof. I've got the truth, and I'm not leaving." A murmur rippled through the gathered onlookers. Grace Holloway stepped forward, her voice quivering but strong. "I remember when Lucille fought for this land. I remember what Redmond tried to pull. You're not the first they've tried to force out, Shaquille." Henry Crawford added, "This land's yours. Everyone knows it. Don't let them tell you otherwise. The tide shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The sheriff glanced at Clifford, then at the growing group of townsfolk, their silent presence a rebuke to the carefully planned seizure. Clifford's face darkened, but Elaine's remained a mask of calm, though a flicker of frustration passed behind her eyes. "Mr. O'Neill," Elaine said smoothly, "this isn't a public debate. This is a legal matter." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "Then let's handle it legally. But you're not taking this cabin today. Not without a fight. Not with fists, but with facts, with truth, and with everyone here as witnesses." The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken challenges. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, then sighed. "Ms. Masters, Mr. Boone, I suggest you consult your attorneys before proceeding further. If there's a dispute, it needs to go through the court. I'm not dragging a man off his land without a clear order." Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. Clifford's jaw tightened, but the sheriff's words had thrown a wrench into their plan. The silent pressure of the onlookers, the weight of the community's watchful eyes, had shifted the balance. The standoff wasn't broken by violence or by dramatic confrontation, but by quiet, persistent resistance. As the sheriff and his deputies climbed back into their vehicles, as Clifford and Elaine conferred in low, frustrated voices, Shaq felt the tight knot in his chest loosen slightly. The cabin still stood, the land still his for now, but he knew this was just a skirmish, not the war. The system Elaine and Clifford wielded was still in play, and they wouldn't give up so easily. Yet for the first time since his return, Shaq felt the quiet strength of community at his back. He nodded his thanks to Grace, to Henry, to the others who lingered, their presence a quiet shield. As the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the land, Shaq stood tall on the porch, knowing the fight was far from over. But today they hadn't won. Today the land was still his, and that was a victory worth claiming. The lake lay still in the early morning light, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the pines that crowded its edges. Shaq stood on the porch of the cabin, the air thick with the remnants of last night's tension. His breath came slow and steady, but his mind churned like the dark water beneath the calm. The weight of the papers he'd hidden in his satchel pressed against his side, a physical reminder of the truth waiting to be revealed. He could feel the shape of the conspiracy tightening around him like a noose, the pieces snapping into place one by one. He spread the papers out on the table, the ledger, the old letters, the notes from his mother. In the quiet light of dawn, the connections glared at him in stark relief. Thomas Redmond's name surfaced again and again, each mention thick with coded language, with references to shell companies and shady transfers. The stories Lucille had heard, the quiet warnings, the evasive officials, all pointed back to Redmond. Decades ago, the man had forged land documents to seize properties around Lake Bellemere, using his wealth and influence to push out families, often without them realizing the land had been stolen from under them. But there was a gap, a missing link in the chain. His mother's cabin. Shaq's eyes narrowed, scanning the ledger for any sign of why Lucille's property had remained untouched in a sea of Redmond's acquisitions. Near the back of the book, in his mother's precise looping script, was a short entry, almost an afterthought. "Redmond's map has a hole. My deed wasn't filed with the others. Safe in the house. As long as I hold it, they can't touch us." The words struck like a hammer blow, their quiet defiance cutting through the decades. His mother had known. She'd discovered Redmond's forgery, realized that her property hadn't been included in his sweep, because her original deed had never been surrendered. It was the one piece of evidence that could prove the entire scheme was built on fraud. Shaq's hands trembled as he pieced it together. Elaine's threats, Clifford's smug presence, the sheriff's uneasy compliance, it all traced back to this missing document. Redmond's death hadn't ended the scheme. It had merely passed the torch to his descendants and allies. They had tried to complete the theft of Lake Bellemere, to tie up the loose ends their patriarch had left behind, and Lucille's cabin, still in the family's hands, was the last obstacle. The whispers of racism, the attempts to paint Shaq as an outsider, were tools in a broader plan to erase not just his claim but the entire history of resistance that Lucille's quiet vigilance represented. Shaq stood by the window, watching the lake shimmer under the rising sun. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Tall, broad-shouldered, but more than just a physical presence. His mind swirled with memories of his mother's quiet strength, her steady hand as she guided him through the treacheries of life beyond the trees. She'd faced a world eager to dismiss her, to overwrite her legacy with silence and erasure. But she'd left him the tools to fight back, and now it was his turn to honor that trust. In the stillness of the cabin, his thoughts became a voiceover in his mind, a reflection on the bitter truths that had shaped his family's place in this land. It was never just about the land. It was about power, about control. Redmond didn't just steal property, he stole stories, stole the right to belong, and now his children and allies are trying to finish what he started. But they didn't count on Lucille. They didn't count on me. His gaze drifted to the old photograph of Lucille on the mantel, her smile steady and unwavering. She saw through their lies, through the sweet-talking neighbors and crooked officials. She kept the truth hidden, safe, because she knew one day it would matter, and now it's up to me to make sure it does. The knock at the door snapped his focus back. It wasn't loud, just a gentle rapping that barely disturbed the silence. Shaq approached cautiously, opening the door a crack. Grace Holloway stood there, her hands wringing the hem of her cardigan, her face etched with worry. "I heard talk in town," she whispered, her voice thin with urgency. "Clifford's planning something. They think they can push you out before the courts even get involved. I thought you should know." Shaq nodded, his gratitude wordless. "Thank you, Grace. But I have something they're not expecting." He gestured her inside, quickly laying out the documents on the table, pointing to the entries in the ledger, the letters, the original deed. Grace's eyes widened as she read, her breath catching. This proves it. They've been lying all along. Redmond's family, the whole scheme, it's all built on a fraud." Shaq's jaw set, determination hardening his features. "That's right, and it's time everyone knew the truth. They thought they could erase us with whispers and lies, but I won't let them." Grace's voice trembled, but it held a note of fierce resolve. "I'll help you. I'll tell the others. There are folks in town who don't agree with what Clifford's doing, but they've been too scared to speak up. Maybe with this," she gestured to the documents, "they'll find their voices." Shaq nodded, the pieces of his plan falling into place. He would take the fight to them, not with fists or threats, but with truth, with the quiet strength his mother had passed down to him. Elaine and Clifford could manipulate the law, spread rumors, lean on old prejudices, but they couldn't rewrite the facts. The original deed, the ledger, the letters, they were his shield, his weapon against the erasure they sought to impose. As the sun climbed higher, casting long beams of light across the cabin's walls, Shaq gathered the documents carefully, tucking them into his satchel. He wasn't just preserving his family's legacy, he was standing against a system that had thrived on silencing voices like his mother's, like his own. The whispers and threats had failed. Now it was time to speak the truth, to shatter the lies with the weight of history itself. He glanced once more at the photograph of Lucille, her smile steady, her gaze unwavering. "You were right, Mama," he murmured. "They can't erase us. Not if we stand strong." The cabin was hushed under the weight of anticipation. Shaq stood by the window, watching the first hints of dawn breaking over Lake Bellemere, casting a pale glow across the water. It had been a night of restless planning, of gathering evidence and tracing the lines of deceit that ran through the town. The original deed, Lucille's ledger, the letters, all of it was ready, a testament to truth and quiet resistance. Yet, it wasn't enough. He needed a voice from within, someone whose testimony could shatter the veneer of respectability that Elaine and Clifford had so carefully constructed. The knock came softly, but Shaq was already moving toward the door. Grace Holloway stood there, her eyes shadowed but determined. She stepped inside, clutching a small folder to her chest as though it might shield her from what was to come. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know what they've done, and I can't stay silent anymore." Shaq's heart surged with gratitude, but he remained steady. "Are you sure, Grace? This isn't going to be easy." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. "I'm sure. I've known Elaine for years. I've seen the things she's done, how she's manipulated the council, twisted the truth. I was scared to speak up, but seeing you stand your ground, it made me realize what's at stake. I brought these." She laid the folder on the table, and Shaq opened it to find signed statements, old correspondence implicating Elaine and Clifford in the scheme, and evidence of bribes paid to county officials to erase records. As he leafed through the papers, the depth of the betrayal unfolded like a bitter story. Grace had kept quiet for too long, but now her voice would be the tipping point, the crack that would splinter the foundation of their deception. She straightened her shoulders, a quiet resolve settling over her. "I'll testify. I'll tell the council, the town, everyone. I won't let them destroy what Lucille built, what you're trying to protect. Shaq's throat tightened, but he kept his voice calm. Thank you, Grace. Your courage means everything. The day unfolded with quiet urgency. Word spread through the town that Grace was ready to speak. At the impromptu town meeting in the community hall, a sense of anticipation hung thick in the air. Elaine sat near the front, her posture rigid, her smile strained. Clifford lounged beside her, his confidence faltering as the room filled with familiar faces, neighbors who had heard whispers but never dared to question. Shaq sat quietly, his documents neatly stacked beside him, his presence calm and composed. Grace stepped forward, her voice wavering at first but growing stronger with each word. She recounted the meetings, the secret deals, the pressure placed on county officials to obscure records. She named names, dates, and payments, her words cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a blade. Clifford's face reddened, Elaine's mask slipping as her gaze darted nervously across the room. The audience listened, rapt, as Grace's testimony peeled back the layers of deception, revealing the rot at the heart of the conspiracy. Shaq's voice joined hers, firm and measured. He laid out the original deed, the ledger, the letters from his mother, each piece fitting into place with Grace's evidence. The story of Redmond's forgery, the continuation of his scheme by his descendants, the coordinated effort to erase his family's legacy, it all unfolded with undeniable clarity. The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, the weight of truth pressing down on them. Elaine stood abruptly, her voice sharp. This is slander. These are lies, meant to cover his own illegal claims. You can't trust these documents, these accusations. But the power in her voice was gone, replaced by desperation. The sheriff, who had once stood on the edge of complicity, now stepped forward, his jaw tight. We'll be reviewing these claims thoroughly, Miss Masters. Until then, consider any action against Mr. O'Neill's property halted. The shift was palpable. The murmurs of doubt turned into quiet support. Neighbors who had once looked at Shaq with suspicion now met his gaze with nods of respect. Elaine's carefully crafted web of control had unraveled, each thread snapped by courage and truth. Clifford, his face pale and drawn, said nothing, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of public exposure. After the meeting, Shaq stepped outside into the fading light. Grace joined him, her expression one of quiet relief mingled with lingering apprehension. They won't stop entirely, she said softly. But now, at least now, the truth is out. Shaq nodded, the weight in his chest easing. It's not about stopping them completely. It's about standing up, showing them they can't erase what's real. Thank you, Grace. You didn't have to do this. But you did. Her smile was faint, but genuine. You reminded me of what's right. Sometimes, that's enough. As the town slowly dispersed, Shaq remained by the lake, the reflection of the setting sun painting gold across the water. He thought of Lucille, her quiet strength, her refusal to let the world silence her. He thought of the whispered threats, the false smiles, the weight of history pressing down on him. And he thought of Grace's courage, of the shift that had begun in the hearts of his neighbors. His voice, soft but resolute, filled the air as if speaking directly to his mother's memory. I'm not here to destroy them. I'm here to tell the truth. To claim what's ours with dignity. To forgive, but not forget. To stand, not just for me but for everyone they tried to erase. In that moment, the battle felt less like a confrontation and more like a quiet reclamation. Not of just land, but of belonging, of truth, of a story that would no longer be hidden in shadows. Shaq's legacy wasn't just about his name. It was about the strength to face injustice with courage, to forgive without surrender, and to reclaim a place in the world where his family's history would stand tall against any attempt to silence it. The lake lay hushed beneath a rising sun, its surface a shimmering mosaic of light and shadow. Shaq stood on the porch of his mother's cabin, the morning air crisp against his skin, the scent of pine and dew heavy in his lungs. For the first time since he'd returned to Lake Bellemere, the weight pressing against his chest felt lighter, as if the very air had shifted with the unraveling of the lies that once threatened to erase his family's history. He looked out across the water, his broad shoulders straight, his stance rooted in a quiet defiance born not from rage, but from resilience. The past weeks had been a storm of whispered threats, legal maneuvering, and the bitter sting of betrayal. But standing here now, with the deed firmly in hand and the truth laid bare for all to see, Shaq felt something deeper stirring, a sense of belonging not granted by wealth or fame, but claimed by the quiet, persistent truth that no one, no matter how powerful, could erase. The cabin, once shadowed by fear, now glowed softly in the morning light, its timbers no longer creaking under the weight of unspoken threats, but standing tall and steady, a testament to the strength of those who'd built it. In his mind, his mother's voice echoed, steady and calm. "Don't let them tell you you don't belong, Shaquille. This land is ours because we made it ours, because we stood when they wanted us to bow." He could almost see her sitting in her old chair by the fireplace, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze steady as she watched the world with quiet understanding. Her memory wrapped around him like a shield, a reminder of the legacy she'd left, not just in deeds and documents, but in the way she lived, the way she'd taught him to stand without stooping, to fight with dignity, and to forgive without forgetting. As the sun rose higher, more neighbors arrived. Grace Holloway, her lined face bright with relief, stood alongside Henry Crawford, their presence a quiet reassurance that the tide had turned. The sheriff, his earlier hesitation replaced by a cautious respect, nodded as he approached. Even those who'd once turned away, uncertain or fearful, now stood at the edge of the clearing, watching with wary curiosity but also with a sense of acknowledgement that the story they'd been told had finally been challenged, dismantled piece by piece. Shaq greeted them with calm nods, his words few but his meaning clear. He wasn't going anywhere. Inside the cabin, he moved through the familiar spaces, each room holding fragments of his family's history, the worn rug by the hearth, the faded photograph of his mother, the dented table where they'd shared meals. The house was no longer just a shelter against the world. It was a living memory, each creak of the floorboards, each soft gleam of sunlight on the walls, a reminder of endurance. He began the quiet work of restoration, not just of the physical space but of the story it held. The peeling paint soon to be repainted, the sagging shelves to be reinforced. It wasn't about making it grand, it was about making it whole again. In a low voice that blended with the rustle of leaves outside, Shaq spoke, not to the gathering crowd, but to the land itself, to the memory of his mother, to the generations past, and those yet to come. They tried to erase us, to write us out of this place, to make us forget we ever belonged. But we didn't just survive. We stood, we spoke, we remembered. And now, we're still here. Not because we fought back with fists, but because we held on to what was rightfully ours, because we believed in truth stronger than their lies. He could feel the weight of history shifting, the cabin's silence filling with the voices of those who had been pushed out before, their stories resurfacing like echoes rising from the walls. The fear that had once gripped his chest was gone, replaced by a deeper understanding that this victory wasn't his alone. It was a reclamation of space, of voice, of memory. He thought of the townspeople who had come to stand beside him, of Grace's trembling but determined testimony, of the quiet nods of support from neighbors who had once looked away. This was more than a personal triumph. It was a collective reckoning, a reminder that power built on silence could be undone by the truth spoken aloud. Outside, the air stirred with the scent of earth and pine, the lake's gentle lapping against the shore a quiet counterpoint to the hum of life returning to the cabin. Shaq stepped out onto the porch, the sunlight warm against his skin. He met the eyes of those gathered, some familiar, some new, all witnesses to a story that had nearly been stolen. He spoke, his voice steady, his words carrying across the still morning air. This place, this land, it's not just mine, it's part of our history, our community. We can't let lies decide who belongs and who doesn't. We can't let power erase the truth. Today, we remember, we stand. The words weren't dramatic, weren't shouted. They were spoken with the quiet conviction of a man who understood that strength wasn't in grand gestures, but in persistence, in standing firm when everything around you tried to push you down. The crowd didn't cheer. They nodded, some stepping forward to shake his hand, others offering quiet words of support. Elaine and Clifford were nowhere to be seen, their plans unraveling in the face of truth, their silence a stark contrast to the voices rising in quiet solidarity. As the morning gave way to afternoon, the cabin buzzed with quiet energy, neighbors offering to help with repairs, stories shared over mugs of coffee, the beginnings of a new chapter unfolding against the backdrop of old walls, now infused with new life. Shaq moved among them, not as the towering celebrity some remembered from distant games and headlines, but as a man who had reclaimed not just a piece of property but a piece of his identity, his family's history, and his place in a community that was learning to see him not as an outsider but as one of their own. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the lake, Shaq stood on the porch once more, his gaze steady on the horizon. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a quiet filled with promise, with the gentle hum of life returning, with the knowledge that the story that had been nearly stolen was now his to tell. His voice, rich with emotion, carried softly into the gathering dusk. We are more than the names they try to erase. We are the stories we carry, the truths we refuse to let go of. And here, in this place, we've written a new ending, one where we stand, not because we're the strongest, but because we're the ones who refuse to be silenced. In that moment, with the cabin standing tall behind him, and the lake stretching wide and open before him, Shaq's story wasn't just about survival. It was about reclamation, resilience, and the quiet, unbreakable strength of a man who, in the face of lies and erasure, chose to stand tall, not as a millionaire, but as a son, a neighbor, and a rightful heir to a legacy no one could take away. Join us as we uncover more stories that challenge silence, confront injustice, and celebrate the unbreakable human spirit. Stay with us for narratives that don't just tell tales, they shift perspectives, amplify voices, and remind us of the power we all hold. This is where truth meets courage, and it's only the beginning.